In the first part of this presentation, I will define who we need to be talking to. Defining our audience is the first step. The second part of the talk will look at framing. I'm going to spend some time on framing so that we can get a shared understanding of what it means and so that we can look at, critically, the framing used in Clean Energy Future and also look at the most commonly used frame that climate change is an environmental threat. Lastly, it will help us to look at how we may reframe the debate around health and livelihood. Here we'll be looking at some of the communication elements I cover in the talk and how we can bring them together to effectively communicate about climate change. This is a short story that I've put here to describe our juncture in history. It's here by way of framing, if you will, the rest of this presentation. People of vision, working together patiently and persistently, have inspired their community and changed the course of history. These leaders, recognizing the threat to civilization posed by climate change, have successfully alerted many of the public to the danger it faces. After many years and great resistance from powerful and ruthless people, an empowered community has achieved an epic win. The country has taken its first steps towards a clean energy future. But time is running out, and much more needs to be done to prevent the catastrophe. Also, their enemies are using lies and fear to win the hearts and minds of the people and destroy their hard-won gains. Everything may be lost unless the leaders reach out to a resistant public in new ways and tell them the truth about the threat to health, lives and livelihoods that we face. This graph is taken from a survey conducted by CSIRO in 2010 and published early last year. It looked at the perceptions and attitudes of Australians to climate change. This question asks, what best describes your thoughts about climate change? In the green we have about 50% who think that climate change is happening and that humans are largely causing it. In the grey, we have about 40% who think that climate change is happening, but it's just a natural fluctuation in the Earth's temperatures. 3.8% don't know, and 5.6% deny that climate change is happening altogether. This graph categorises the previous question according to voting intention. Looking at the grey bunch, the natural causes, we see that they are concentrated amongst independent voters and voters for the coalition parties. There's a sizable minority among Labor voters, but in the main, they make up the majority of Conservative voters. In other words, if you want to make good on stopping climate change, we have to reach and engage with coalition voters. We need to find new ways to cross traditional divides, and we need to create a new consensus in the public mind that climate change is caused by humans and is a threat that must be addressed urgently. The CSIRO survey is one of many that have been done over the years and around the world. One of the common findings is the perception that climate change is far off in the future and that it will happen somewhere else far away from here. The CSIRO study tends to make the same finding. This question asks, how worried are you about climate change? Looking at the grey cohort, our natural causes bunch, we find that they are distributed among somewhat worried, not very worried, and not at all worried. The question here is, how much do you think climate change will harm you personally? The grey group say a moderate amount, only a little, and not at all. Notice how this contrasts with the human inducers. To the question, how much have you personally experienced the effects of climate change? Here the results are even more marked. The grey group says a moderate amount, a little, not at all. Again, notice the contrast with the human inducers. So, in short, our challenge is to make this issue personal and to demonstrate that the issue is affecting our target audience in a personal way. The challenge is also to demonstrate the local impacts of climate change. This question asked who they viewed as a trustworthy source of information on climate change. Notice the significant difference in the profile between the human-induced and the natural causes. Even so, both tended to agree that university scientists were most trustworthy, but by contrast, the natural causes thought that family and friends and doctors were next most trustworthy, followed closely by people from your community. This suggests that using doctors as spokespeople on climate change is necessary. It also suggests that a significant campaign focus may need to be upon engaging social networks in the target communities to activate peer-to-peer influencing. Picking up on the theme of who may act as a credible source of information on climate change, we have this list taken from the Reader's Digest survey of most trusted professions last year. The first thing to note is that almost all of these professions are involved in emergency services, the ones engaged in the response to and recovery from extreme weather events. Also interestingly, in the list are farmers, who in our context could be recruited to speak about impacts of climate change on the land. I'd now like to move on to frames. Here I'd like to create a shared understanding about frames. We often hear the word used, let's frame it like this, how are we going to frame it, etc. Most often this usage is talking about the choice of words that are going to be applied. There may be passing reference to the underlying conceptual content, but it tends to stop there. What I'd like to draw your attention to is a deeper operation of frames, how they shape the meaning of things. This quote comes from George Lakoff, a cognitive linguist who you may have heard of. Framing is not primarily about politics or political messaging or communication. It is far more fundamental than that. Frames are the mental structures that allow human beings to understand reality, and sometimes to create what we take to be reality. Frames facilitate our most basic interactions with the world. They structure our ideas and concepts. They shape the way we reason, and they even impact how we perceive and how we act. For the most part, our use of frames is unconscious and automatic. We use them without realizing it. So when we talk about frames, we're talking about mental structures. That is, we're talking about processes of the mind. We now know that processes of the mind, like mental structures, are activities of the body. In particular, they are activity of the brain and the nervous system that extends from the brain throughout our bodies. In this way, we can say that we have an embodied mind. This understanding is really very recent. For the better part of 400 years, the mind was thought to be disembodied, that mind and body were separate entities. Not so. So the mental structures we refer to as frames exist in the brain. How does this work? The brain has around 120 billion neurons, which are nerve cells, each of which are interconnected with many others. In fact, on average, each neuron has about 10,000 connections to other neurons. What we have up in our skulls is a highly networked structure crammed into a very small space. It is thought that these mental structures are physically represented in our neural networks. Let's look at how this works in very simple terms. Neurons that fire together wire together. Neurons send messages to each other using electricity and chemicals. This is where firing comes from. An example of how this works is when we're learning to ride a bike. At first we have to learn how to sit on a bike, how to balance, how to push the pedals, how to steer, how to overcome our fears, etc. All of these trials are stimuli that are firing our neural networks. As we continue to practice, a pattern emerges. The same neural networks keep firing, and those networks, as they continue to fire, undergo a chemical process that reinforces those particular networks entailed in learning to ride a bike. This is how we learn anything for the first time. Trial and error, repetition. This explanation is just as applicable to social relations, whether they are in the family, or work, or amongst peers. it also applies to the acquisition of values, political views, ideologies, and ultimately is implicated in the formation of our very identity. These are all mental structures, frames. The next feature of our brains I'd like to mention is activation and inhibition. Activation refers to when our neural networks are engaged in any way, for example, to ride a bike, or to make a decision, say, about a political issue. Let's take the example of two opposing views on a political issue to illustrate activation and inhibition. The issue of taxation. For example, Tony Abbott may talk about tax relief. The use of this frame conjures the association that tax is a burden or a pain from which you will be relieved if you vote for the coalition. On the other hand, you may hear about raising revenue to invest in the public good. Here is a frame with associations of improved health, education, and life opportunities. Most people would hold both these frames in mind. One may be more dominant than the other, which may account for their position on the issue, should they be forced to make a decision either way. The way activation works is that when one frame is activated, the opposing frame or alternate frames are inhibited. When Tony Abbott says tax relief, that frame is activated in you and you are primed to reason within the terms of that frame. At the same time, the invest in public good frame is inhibited. The final feature I wanted to tell you about is plasticity. That is, our capacity for our neural networks to remold themselves in response to new patterns of stimuli. In other words, you can change your mind, either with focused attention to cultivate a new behaviour or under the influence of the external environment. In childhood, right up to early adulthood, this ability is much greater, and it persists through our lives to a lesser degree, though persist it does. In other words, we can change our mental structures. I'd like to expand some more on how frames work by using this example, the example of home. The word home only makes sense to us because we have the mental structures built up over time from our life experiences to give it meaning. So for example, we would have the experience of a dwelling. It may have been like this or something not too dissimilar. It's also likely there were some people involved, in this case a family. Notice that this frame has a setting, the house. It has characters, each with their special roles, father, mother, siblings, etc. There would also be events that occurred in the lived experience that would also become part of this frame. Moving in, first day at school, learning to ride the bike, and so on and on. And there will be the feelings, thoughts and emotions associated with this experience that would also become part of this frame. So notice that there is a story, a history, a narrative embedded in this mental structure. Notice also how these images are prototypical. In other words, they may be the first that people would call to mind when asked to describe a home. In this way, frames are very culturally determined. Here is a non-prototypical home. We can imagine the life that may have been lived in this type of home. We also have metaphorical homes like this one. Here we map the features of our mental structure of home onto the earth. Earth is a type of dwelling. It is a dwelling for the human family. In this way, we can talk about planet Earth as our home. Now that we've got a handle on what frames are and on how frames work, I'd like to draw your attention to one of the most prevalent and dominant frames in Western culture. A person is a rational actor. This frame has been with us for around 400 years. It's had a resurgence in the last 40 or so years in the form of neoliberalism, or economic rationalism as we sometimes call it. It pervades our government, its Department of Treasury and Finance. It certainly dominates in the corporate sector, is rampant in the media. In short, it affects the lives of millions. As the picture suggests, the main feature of this mental structure is that humans are autonomous individuals acting in their own self-interest. that they reason by cold calculation, weighing up the advantages or disadvantages without emotion. In other words, people, everybody, you and me, each of us are motivated only by what's in it for me. Two other features of this model are: 1, to reason rationally all you need is perfect information, and 2, that emotions are separate from and inferior to rational thought. There are a number of other features of this model that I won't cover in this talk. Suffice to say that without qualification, all its attributes on each and every count are wrong. This model is wrong. Science has proven this conclusively. Humans are not like this. Firstly, reasoning is not dependent on information alone. As we've seen by framing, reasoning is dependent on our lived experience. We're very much shaped by our culture and values and contingent on other mental structures. 2, each and every decision we make, all our reasoning, is emotional in some measure. And lastly, we are social animals whose instinct of empathy and reciprocation make us very good at cooperation. Indeed, our survival and success as a species has depended on these very qualities. But let's move on to some of the entailments of this mental structure. You'd be familiar with many of these statements. As I read them out, I'd like you to keep in mind the Clean Energy Future legislation and the state of play with the expansion of coal mining currently underway in this country, already the world's #1 supplier of coal. Markets are natural and naturally good. Government is distinct from markets and intrudes upon them. Nature is a resource to be exploited. The economy and environment are distinct and inevitably in conflict with one another. Polluting is a right, so companies should be compensated for the cost of cleanup. Wealth is measured simply by money. Here are some more. Environmental action will cost us jobs. Australian companies will be burdened by additional costs. Addressing global warming will put our economy at a competitive disadvantage versus the rest of the world. Renewable energy must compete with traditional energy sources like coal and oil before it can be implemented. Now, I'd like to draw your attention to how elements of this frame that I've read out are embedded in the Clean Energy Future legislation. For example, markets are natural and naturally good. This element can be seen embedded as a preference for carbon trading rather than a permanently fixed and escalating carbon price. Companies will be burdened by additional costs. We see free permits, buyouts, loan guarantees. It will put our economy at a competitive disadvantage. Trade-exposed industries are given protection. Renewable energy must compete. We're still lacking a national feed-in tariff known to be the most effective way of institutionalising renewable energy. Turning now to the publicity campaign for Clean Energy Future. This is the first thing we see when we go to the Clean Energy Future website. Basically it says, "What's in it for me?" Here we can see we're working within the terms of the individual is a self-interested actor frame. Here is some of the rhetoric on the site. The plan will cut pollution and drive investment, helping to ensure Australia can compete and remain prosperous in the future. The cheapest and most effective way, helping households save money on their energy bills. Price impacts of introducing a carbon price. Everything is framed around self-interest. Importantly, we're now describing Australia, the nation, as a self-interested individual competing against other nations. This is a very common metaphor, a form of the self-interested frame, where nations are themselves rational actors, acting in their national self-interest. Here is how climate change is referred to. Climate change is a threat to the environment, economy and way of life. By acting now, Australians can look forward to long-term prosperity while protecting our environment now and for future generations. I'd like to draw your attention to the word environment and some of its shortcomings. The word environment is what's known in cognitive linguistics as a superordinate category, making it difficult to relate to. What do we mean by this? An example of a superordinate category is furniture. When I say furniture, you don't have a firm idea of any one thing. This contrasts with the basic level category, words like chair, table, bench, couch, seat. All these words call to mind an image, even a feeling, because we have an experience of it. We don't sit in furniture, we sit in a chair. We have a bodily relationship to it, an experience which is hardwired. So using superordinate categories such as environment isn't going to activate empathy or any relationship. Contrast that with this statement. We depend on a safe climate for clean and plentiful water to drink, clean air to breathe, good soil for food, strong health, our livelihoods, and the life chances of our children. This is really spelling it out in basic level terms. Water, drink, air, breathe, soil, food, health, children. Recall how we spoke about the perceptions of distance in time and space. Having this word in the slogan doesn't help the cause. It really should be something like this. Recall how we said neurons that fire together wire together. The more we project this frame, the more it becomes embedded. The more it is a shared mental structure, the more it becomes common sense. Worse still, because it is informed by the self-interested rational actor frame, every time it's activated, it inhibits opposite frames. Frames like, people need to pull together to stop dangerous climate change. This is the frame that has been the flagship of communication to date. Climate change is an environmental threat. There are good reasons for this. It is an environmental threat. The frame itself is deeply informed by the science, which are the earth sciences, atmospheric science, oceanography, ecology, climatology, physics, chemistry, etc. It is also the case that the main intermediaries, the conduit of this information from the scientists to the public, have been the environment movement and its organisations, who traditionally act as a voice for nature. In Australia, in the course of this communication, we've made use of iconic landscapes like Kakadu National Park and the Great Barrier Reef, in addition to numerous references to Antarctica, the Arctic, polar bears, etc., etc. Recall the perception of climate change as distant in time and space. The bright green shows where Kakadu National Park is located and roughly where the Great Barrier Reef is. Down here is where the main population centres are. In other words, we're not going to address the perceived distance of climate change by talking about very distant and exotic landscapes. The same applies to Antarctica, a few thousand kilometres south of this map, and the Arctic, several thousand kilometres north of this map. Rather, we need to centre our communication on the local impacts of climate change, and there are some interesting studies to show how demonstrating the local impacts of climate change to the local community has far more powerful motivating effect. Now recall how we said that frames are mental structures and that these mental structures shape our perception of reality. This effect can be demonstrated by studies which show a tendency called the confirmation bias. I believe there's reasonable grounds to suspect that the environmental threat frame suffers from a form of confirmation bias. What is the confirmation bias? There's a few facets to it. They are that we strongly tend to 1. Actively seek out those facts that confirm our worldview. 2. We screen out those facts that don't accord with our existing worldview. And 3. We apply a much higher standard of evidence to those facts that challenge our worldview. Taking into consideration that the natural causer group we identified earlier are overwhelmingly conservative voters, it's not unreasonable to conclude that the environmental threat frame is not going to get much traction because of the way all greenie issues are perceived. We need a new approach, one that's immediate, personal and local, one that centres on health and livelihood. Before I expand on that, I'd like to address the issue of fear. One of the consistent things I've encountered in conversations with campaigners and their approach to communication is a tendency to shy away from vivid, that is, realistic portrayals of climate change impacts. In my conversations, the feedback I get is that we don't want to frighten the horses and that talking about impacts is a turn-off. The problem with this approach, and it's not the only one, is that in reality, the truth is out there. This is a selection of headlines, one you'd typically find on any given day in the media. These come in waves, usually with the release of a major report, for example an IPCC assessment report, or around a conference of parties meeting. And we now know that as these messages are projected into the public concern with the issue increases. However, there is a real danger associated with this, and that is that while people are being told that the world as we know it is changing for the worse, they are not being told what to do about it. And this is precisely what leads to apathy and a sense of helplessness. In other words, we need to own the threat message and provide people with a way forward. We need to pair those elements together, otherwise there will be a turn-off. I'll explain the mechanics of this in the next few slides. So let's turn to health promotion, because in this field there's been a lot of scholarship on the business of dealing with scary stuff, like life-threatening diseases, cancer, HIV/AIDS, etc., or life-threatening behaviours like smoking or sharing needles or driving too fast, and motivating people to change their ways, to do something about it. It's not just that health promotion happens to be a handy guide for us, it's also the fact that climate change is, in its own right, a massive health and well-being threat. So I'd like to look at the extended parallel processing model of communication. This is a model widely trialled and applied, and as I describe it to you, you'll recognise its use. These are the components of a health threat message. Firstly, you have the threat component. This consists of a depiction of the threat severity, how bad it will be, and it consists of a depiction of the susceptibility, spelling out who is at risk. The next component is the recommended response. This aims to build agency, the yes we can part of the message. This consists of response efficacy, building a perception that the recommended action will work. It includes a depiction of self-efficacy, that is, building a perception that your audience can do the required action. Lastly, the message must address any perceived barriers to taking action. This is a simplified model of how this all works. In the yellow here, you have the message components I've just described. In the orange, you have the perception effects, perceived efficacy and perceived threat. Fear is generated. There is one of two paths the response may take. The desired outcome is the danger control response. Here the audience is motivated to protect themselves and accepts the message. The other path is fear control. Here the audience actively controls their fear and rejects the message. This is the path that leads to denial, apathy, a sense of helplessness. It is the balance between perceived efficacy and perceived threat that makes all the difference between which pathway is taken. Let's look at this in more detail. What I'm about to tell you is based on what studies of this model have shown. On the vertical axis, we have a measure of less or more efficacy. On the bottom left would be an underplayed recommendation, like call this number. At the top left, we have a recommended response that is really vividly spelled out. So from this diagram, we can see that the amount of efficacy in your message really determines the nature of the response. either a fear control one with low efficacy or a danger control one with strong efficacy messages. On the horizontal axis, we have a measure of threat message, from no threat on the left to very high threat on the right. We can see that the level of perceived threat determines the strength of the response. This yellow spot here on the vertical axis signifies that tipping point in your audience between one response or the other. The only way to know what this point is by studying the audience and getting to know how they perceive an efficacious response. And the same can be said for threat perception. So what this diagram indicates, based on meta-studies of health risk messages, is that the higher the threat, the stronger the response, and the higher the efficacy, the more likely that response will be a strong danger control response. Good health risk messages have high threat and high efficacy components. So studies show that for effective messages, 1. The high threat message is personal and vivid, both in language and pictures. And 2. The high efficacy message clearly explains how to take action. It addresses barriers to action, and it tells us that the action works. Also, it may make use of role play or modelling to convey the recommended response in action. Just to recap, there's no beyond blue. It's common practice when there's an article or TV segment about bullying or suicide for there to be a phone number given for people to contact. This doesn't happen for climate change. There is no recommended response, like phone this number or who you should vote for or sign this petition. There should be, but there isn't. So we need to take control of this problem by honest depictions of the threat, closely paired with what you can do about it. Another way we can think about the task ahead of us is to consider the way we make categories. Humans make categories. We categorize things as dangerous or safe, moral or immoral, etc. A category is a mental structure, a cognitive model like frames, that helps us to understand the world. It used to be thought that categories were a straightforward grouping of things that share a common attribute, and that there was a simple one-to-one relationship between categories as we perceive them and things in the world. Although categories do tend to describe groups of like things, their grouping can be dependent on human perception. Recall how we talked about superordinate and basic level categories in the case of furniture, chairs, tables, etc. The basic level category is derived from our bodily relationship, our experience of that object. It's based upon how we perceive the shape of the object. Another way we tend to structure categories is around prototypes. That is, there is one among the group in the category whose attributes are considered to be central and defining of that category. All the other members of the category would share one, a few, or many of those defining features, but would vary in some significant way that would mark it as non-prototypical. One famous example is of a bird. Most people, when asked to define a typical bird, would say smallish, wings, can fly, has a beak. They wouldn't describe a penguin or a cassowary. Now let's turn to the category of harm. That is, let's examine, keeping climate change in mind, how the category of harm is structured. Like many categories, it too is structured around a central defining type that links to other non-prototypical variants. In this case, the prototype of harm is bodily harm. That is, any type of direct harm that is done to your body, for example injuries such as a broken arm. Recall that we are talking here about a bodily relationship. The prototype in this case is bodily experience. Structured around this category are other types of harm: disease and illness, mental illness, personal insult. Personal insult is linked to all sorts of moral harms which extend from the personal into social networks and society as a whole. That is, when we decide between right and wrong, we are basically deciding between harmful or not harmful. There is harm to well-being and livelihood, losing your job, financial loss, which also extends from the personal to the social. Now recall the environmental threat frame. What this frame has done, and rightly so, is to map the experience of harm onto the environment, species loss, habitat destruction, etc. But what it hasn't done is map the experience of climate change harm onto all these other subcategories of harm. This is the task ahead of us, telling the story about how climate change and its causes, like mining coal, will harm our health, well-being and livelihood. By contrast, recall the anti-carbon tax campaign. It was very specific in how it mapped harm onto each and every subcategory. You lose your job, it will cost you more, on and on. Now I'd like to talk about empathy. On the left we have a picture of some coral. This coral is in a state of high stress. It's just found out that it has only a few years left to live, and it's seen many of its close relations die around it in recent times. On the right, we have a picture of an 8-year-old Caucasian female who is experiencing an asthma attack. My question to you is, who do you empathise with the most? The coral? Or with the little girl having a very painful and frightening asthma attack? Let's talk more about empathy. What is empathy? Empathy is the ability to sense the experience of others and to project ourselves into that experience. This is a picture of the brain. The coloured areas mark the location of neural networks known as the mirror neuron system. It is now understood that this system is responsible for our sense of empathy. It connects what we see or hear another person doing with our own bodies, activating the same neurons, helping us to sense and feel what they are feeling. Here I hope you can see how critical this sense of empathy is for us as social animals. It underlies our ability to function as social animals, to nurture, to cooperate, to reciprocate, to learn, and therefore to gain a sense of control in the world. Empathy works from near to far. It responds best to other people. It will respond better to people you know, like your family, than to strangers. It will respond better to people than other mammals, mammals better than insects, and definitely respond better to people than to landscapes, especially coral ones, anytime. This is why we need to bring depictions of people into our messages. This is, after all, what we're on about, the protection of people. In doing this, we need to cover off on some fairly intrinsic aspects of human life and behaviours as social animals. Firstly, that we have families, kinship ties. We need to depict our nurturance and our reproductive success. We need to depict how we thrive across the generations and intergenerational continuity. We need to show how we make our livelihoods, our work, the activity we undertake every day to support and nurture our families, and the activities we do to fulfill ourselves, realise dreams, ambitions. We need to depict community and group affiliation. And we need to appeal to our sense of belonging as a people. We share a common destiny. There are institutional, historical and cultural bonds that we share. We share this patch of earth together. Why are these depictions important? Reframing our message around people tells a story about life, and importantly, that we are the protectors and sustainers of life. We are on the side of life, and the other mob, the Minerals Council, they are on about something else. So this is how we should reframe our communication. This frame will make the problem personal. It can make it more immediate. It could overcome the perception that climate change is distant in time and space. It will take our efforts out of the bloody greenie mindset. It can connect to the essential elements of human life and how they're affected by climate change. And it can engage with empathy to a new constituency. I'd like to have a go now at showing you how these elements may work. Frames, employing health threat messaging, accessing empathy, and using depictions of human life. Hi, I'm Kate. Last year when Hayden was born, it was just before the big floods. The house went under, so we knew we'd lost most of our possessions, but we were very glad we made it out alive. We weren't the only ones. We lived for 2 weeks in the evacuation centre, which was challenging with the little one. After we got back home and did the big clean-up, it made me think about climate change. The facts are that climate change is caused by pollution from burning coal for power and burning other fuels like oil and gas, causing more frequent and extreme droughts, bushfires, and floods, and a whole lot of other health risks. And that's why I joined my local climate action network, which is one of the fastest growing communities in Australia. We bring people together, talk with our local member of parliament and make our voices heard, so that we can have clean, renewable energy powering our homes and workplaces. Being involved has made a difference for me and my family, and working together I know we can make a world of difference for Hayden.